Today we're going to show you how to remove and replace the trigger shoe and trigger springs in your CZ Scorpion Evo 3. The first thing we're going to do is check to make sure the weapon's clear. Check the chamber, no magazine. We're going to operate the bolt a couple times. Verify the weapon's clear. With the bolt back, we're going to remove the lower receiver. Simply push the pin through the lower receiver and rotate it off. Now we're going to set the upper assembly aside and come back to it later. With the lower receiver removed from the upper, all we're going to need to do is remove the two safety selectors and the trigger housing screw, and that's going to let us access the trigger pack. To get the safety selectors off, use a 1.5mm Allen key and remove the selectors. We're going to do the right side first. With the selector in the fire position, remove the set screw using your 1.5mm Allen. Just rotate the selector off and push the other selector through the trigger pack. The only thing left now is the trigger housing screw. It's a 3mm Allen key. We can go in through the access port in the trigger guard and remove that. And just kind of flip the lower receiver over, tap it a little bit. Trigger pack falls out, and we can set the lower receiver aside. And now we're just going to work on disassembling the trigger pack. With the trigger pack removed from the lower receiver, we can start to disassemble it. The first thing we want to do is release the spring tension that's built up inside the pack right now. When we remove the lower receiver from the upper receiver, we had to put the hammer into the cock position. So let's go ahead and use our thumb to hold the hammer and pull the trigger. And that's going to let us slowly release the hammer forward and take off any spring tension that's built up inside the pack. Now it's completely safe to disassemble. Start by pushing our 5mm pin through the trigger pack. We're going to push it about 3/4 of the way through, and when you feel the hammer start to kind of loosen up, that means the pin's gone through the hammer. So remove your hammer and work your pin a little further through the pack and remove the hammer spring and remove your 5mm pin completely. And now we got the firing pin disconnect, and what I like to do is kind of push down on the trigger return spring before we remove it. That'll take the preload off the firing pin block. I'm going to use a cotton swab. The stick or the handle on the swab is a wooden dowel. It's nice because it doesn't scratch your lower receiver parts, and it does let you capture the spring. As you push on the spring, it's actually going to form a little groove in the bottom of the dowel. So push down on our spring and remove firing pin disconnect. And at this point we're going to start to work this 1.5mm pin out of the sear. So again, kind of going from left to right, push the 1.5mm pin through the pack. The first thing to come out is going to be your trigger return spring, and then the next thing is going to be the disconnector. Remove it, remove disconnector spring. There's a spacer or a collar in there. Go ahead and remove the collar and finish pulling your 1.5mm pin out of the trigger pack. That's going to let the sear and the trigger shoe come out. And we have now completely disassembled the trigger pack on our Scorpion. With the sear and trigger shoe removed from the trigger pack housing, we're going to put this assembly into the vise and remove the trigger shoe. In our vise, we're going to use aluminum soft jaws. You might also use neoprene soft jaws, plastic soft jaws. We've got some nylon jaws here that we could use. Aluminum seems to work better. For us, we're not trying to smash the sear. We're just going to kind of hold it in place. Don't apply too much pressure. We're just going to use the vise to support the sear as we drive the roll pin through the trigger shoe. It is a 3mm roll pin, so we're going to use a 3mm roll pin punch. You might also be able to use a 5/32 pin punch if you have one. And to remove the roll pin, just lightly tap it through the trigger shoe. With the roll pin removed, just pull up on the trigger shoe. It should come off the sear. Now's a good time to inspect the sear for any debris, carbon, any burrs that might have been left on there at the factory. Just make sure it's a clean, nice mating surface for the new trigger shoe. In this example, we're going to install an HBI theta forward trigger. The HBI shoes all come with new roll pins. You could reuse the factory roll pin if you like, or you can use the new roll pin, completely up to you. The first thing that I like to do is start the roll pin into the trigger shoe before inserting the shoe onto the sear. This prevents us from having to hold the shoe, the roll pin, the punch, the hammer all at the same time. Don't start it into the pocket, just start it into the outside wall of the shoe, and go ahead and slide that back onto the sear. It should sit flush with the sear, with the face of the sear. Again, any debris or any buildup in there is going to prevent the shoe from installing correctly. So with the new trigger shoe sitting flush on the sear, go ahead and tap the roll pin through the new shoe. Because it's a coiled roll pin, we need to make sure we use a roll pin punch that's larger than the 3mm roll pin itself. Using a 1/8 inch or smaller punch is going to cause the roll pin to uncoil, and like a little cinnamon roll, you'll see the coil start to push out the backside. So use a 5/32, a 3/16 punch. You can use a 5mm punch if you have metric set, but something larger than 3mm is the key. And just kind of tap that roll pin through the new shoe. And with the new roll pin installed, we kind of want to just feel. We could also we could try to measure too. We were looking for 10mm across the shoe, but just with your fingers, you can try to feel. Make sure your roll pin's flush on both sides. If you push coils out of the roll pin, or if you've not installed it far enough, the roll pin itself is going to drag on the lower receiver, kind of where the trigger comes through the trigger housing, or through the trigger guard. So with the new trigger shoe installed, let's remove our sear from the vise, and we're going to go ahead and reassemble our trigger pack. In this pack, we're going to use the HBI reduced weight trigger spring kit to help us get the pull weight down from the factory 10-pound, 10.5, 12-pound trigger pulls down to about 5.5 pounds. The kit comes with a new trigger return spring and a new disconnector spring. So let's go ahead and discard our factory springs, and in their place we're going to use the HBI reduced weight springs. The first thing to do when reassembling the pack is to drop the sear and trigger shoe down into the sheet metal housing. With those components in place, let's start our 1.5mm pin through the pack to capture the sear. Then we're going to install our spacer. After the spacer is installed, we're going to drop our new disconnector spring in there. The spring is not directional. It has no top, no bottom. You can put it into the pocket either way. So go ahead and drop that spring into the pocket and put the disconnector on top of it, and continue to advance the 1.5mm pin further into the pack. The last piece to go down by the sear is going to be our trigger return spring. We're going to put the small leg facing down when it's in the pack, so the shorter leg of the spring is going to make contact with the bottom of our trigger pack. So with that in place, finish pushing the 1.5mm pin into the pack, and let's go ahead and install our firing pin disconnect. The easiest way that I found to install this component is to grab it with your thumb and hold it up against the trigger pack with one hand, and then with the other hand use a wooden dowel. In this case we're going to use a cotton swab, but you could also use chopsticks or just a regular wooden dowel to kind of push on the trigger return spring and get it underneath the disconnector hook. Once it's underneath the disconnector hook, we're going to put the hook into the sear. So go ahead and use our wooden tool to rotate the trigger return spring down underneath the disconnect bar. With it under the disconnect bar, push the firing pin disconnect bar into the mating notch on the sear. With that in place, we're going to use our 5mm pin and capture the disconnect bar. Once the 5mm pin is in the disconnect bar, we can take our hand off of the part. The next component is going to be our hammer spring. Let's install that into the trigger pack. We're going to advance our 5mm pin a little bit further and insert our hammer, put it between the spring. With the hammer installed, go ahead and push the 5mm pin all the way through until it is flush with the other side of the pack, and we can go ahead and function check our pack. Let's make sure the hammer engages the sear and the disconnector doesn't hook it. We can also check for proper disconnect at this point and see that our disconnector is falling off the hammer. So go ahead and lock the hammer into the cock position where it's engaged with the sear, and now we're going to install the trigger pack back into the lower receiver. To do that, just slide the pack from the top side into the receiver. Once it's down in the receiver, let's go ahead and drop our 3mm screw back in. So place it into the hole in the lower receiver, come through the trigger guard, and tighten up our screw. Now let's install our safety selectors. Go ahead and slide it through the pack. And once it's in place, grab the other selector lever, place it back on, drop our 1.5mm set screw down there. With these set screws, if they are not clean, they'll tend to strip or bind or cross thread, so make sure your screw is clean before you reinsert it. If while you're installing the screw you run into any resistance, go ahead and stop, back the screw out, check to make sure it's clean. You could use a wire brush to clean if you need to, and go ahead and reinstall. We can function check the trigger again, so we'll make sure the selector is in the fire position and get a hold on our hammer, pull the trigger. When we bring our hammer back, we're going to look that it engages the sear and locks to it. It's going to be completely disconnected from the disconnector. If we pull our trigger, holding the trigger back, and bring our hammer back again, the disconnector should catch it, and as we release the trigger slowly, we should feel it disconnect and grab the sear. So might try it a few times before we install it back in the upper, just to make sure we got the right function. So now all that's left is to install the lower receiver back into our upper. Same way we took it off, rotate it back in, push our pin back through, and go and check for function. Weapon's clear, and now we're ready to go to the range and test. Thanks for watching.